to. I'm not an environmentalist. I've never thought of myself that way. I don't think of myself as a nature person. I didn't just go to Arsman. I grew up in the city. I went to elementary school in East Harlem. I have spent my whole life walking down these concrete streets, looking up at these skyscrapers, and thinking that modern life was a fortress against the forces of the natural world, and that we were protected from climate change no matter how scary it got, because we were living in the 20th and then the 21st centuries. So like a lot of people I know, I think I spent most of that life really complacent and deluded about the threat from global warming, which I took to be happening really slowly, far away, and at a level that would not really threaten the lives of the people that I loved. And I think come to realize over the last couple of years working in this material that in each of those ways I was really, really wrong. And I think it's illustrative to talk about maybe each of those delusions in turn. I'll do it really quickly. Some of you may have even heard me say these things before, so I'll rush through. But I spent my life thinking that climate change was slow, that it was the legacy of what our grandparents and great-grandparents had done, and that it was our responsibility to do something about it because not because it would affect our lives, but because it would affect the lives of our grandchildren. So this is like a story of centuries. But half of all of the emissions that have ever been produced in the entire history of humanity have come in the last 30 years. That's since Al Gore published his first book on warming. It's since the UN established the IPCC report, the IPCC body, which means, we've done more damage knowingly than we ever managed in ignorance. And that is especially concerning given where we are now, when we're seeing a great awakening of political understanding on this issue, but not yet much policy change. And I think we risk falling into a different kind of complacency if we assume that knowledge and concern is sufficient to really take the action of the scale that we need. Climate change is actually happening really fast. We're seeing it now in real time. Heat waves in Europe, they set a record in June, they set another record in July, they almost set a record in August. These were temperature records that used to last centuries, broken 3 times in the summer. A few weeks ago, there was a storm that hit Houston, the 5th 500-year storm to hit Houston in 5 years. 500-year storm, supposed to hit once every 500 years. 500 years ago, Hernando Cortez had just landed in Mexico. There were no European settlements in North America, so we're talking about a storm that was supposed to hit once during the entire history of the European settlement of the Americas. Waging the genocide against the native people, establishing of colonies, fighting a revolution, building a slave empire, fighting a civil war, industrializing World War I, World War II, the Cold War, end of the Cold War, end of history, the financial crisis. All of that was supposed to contain one storm of this intensity, and Houston's seen 5 of them in the last 5 years. So we're already living in completely unprecedented climate conditions and seeing the effects of the damage we're doing in real time. How fast it's happening. The second big delusion that I had growing up was about the scope of the problem. I heard a lot about Arctic ice and sea level rise, and I felt that meant that if I lived somewhere other than the coast, I would be safe. And when I looked at the map of the world, I thought, okay, there are going to be some places that are going to have their maps redrawn, and there are going to be some people that are going to have to move. But the vast majority of the world looks really habitable if all you care about is sea level rise. The more that I learned about the economic impacts, which could mean by the end of the century we'd have a global GDP 30% smaller than it would be without climate change. It's an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression. It would be permanent. Or the agricultural yields, which could be half as bountiful as they are today, and would be using them to feed probably 50% more people. Or the effect on conflict, which could double or more by the end of the century if we don't change course. On refugees, which could, according to the UN, we could have as many as 1 billion climate refugees, which is as many people as today live in North and South America combined. Public health issues, mosquitoes that carry malaria and are today living just in the tropics will be flying as far north as the Arctic Circle in the second half of the century. The wildfires that have swept through California over the last few years are set to at least double and probably quadruple just by mid-century. Scientists don't even know how to model the second half of the century because they think by 2050 so much of the state will have burned, we don't know what foliage is going to grow back in its place, and so we can't make an estimate of how flammable it is. These are all, when you add these things up, you see that this is not a compartmentalizable story. It's not something you can escape through where you live or how much money you have. It is all-encompassing. It is the theater in which all of us are living. And that may not seem like a revelation to you, probably because you've been thinking about these things for longer than I have, but I really did believe that I spent my life living outside of nature when I realized that everything that I do and everything that we all do is dependent on the natural world and on the climate. I realized that everything we do and take for granted as permanent features of modern life are really vulnerable to changes in that climate. So that's the second big delusion I had. The third was about the severity of the problem. This has changed a little bit over the last year, really, since I've been writing about it, but it really used to be the case that we didn't hear much about climate scenarios that were north of 2 degrees of warming, which scientists called the threshold of catastrophe, and the island nation of the world called genocide. And I think there's some technically feasible way that we could avoid 2 degrees of warming if we instituted a major revolutionary transformation today. But practically speaking, given the politics we have, given the culture we have, I think the likelihood is that we pass 2 degrees of warming, at least for a time. And we have really not yet begun to think about how totally that could transform all of our lives, not just through the direct climate impacts that I mentioned, but the way that it changed our politics. If you have hundreds of millions of climate refugees, how will it change our geopolitics? How will we think about the relationship of the developed world to the developing world, when much of the developing world has the whole prospect of economic growth stripped out of their future by the force of climate change? For so long, the West has said to the global South, okay, we're richer than you are, but if you play by our rules, you're going to get richer in the future. Within a few decades, that promise may not be able to hold at all. And by the end of the century, it's expected that if climate change continues, the whole equatorial band of the planet will have no hope of economic growth at all. I don't mean to sound explicitly like an economist. Those impacts are catastrophic in ways that are not measurable by economic data, but especially if we get past 2 degrees, and even really at the level of warming we have today, we're already dealing with a level of suffering that any moral conscience would declare impossible to accept. And I think that means that we need quite dramatic change very rapidly. And I think there are reasons to think that some of those changes are happening. When I turned in my book last September, I'd never heard of Greta Thunberg. Nobody outside of Sweden had heard of her. Extinction Rebellion hadn't even formed in the UK. Sunrise hadn't announced itself in the US. We're now, Conservative Parliament has now declared a climate emergency in England. The President of the EU is committed to spending a quarter of his budget on climate adaptation and mitigation. In the US, we're debating a Green New Deal, and we're going through a presidential primary where all of the major candidates are competing with one another to be more serious than the next guy about climate. This is a completely different political landscape than even seemed possible last September when I turned in the book. And it's really exhilarating to think about how much has changed in how little time. Not just because we're farther along where we need to be, but because, if what was once considered really hard to do now seems totally plausible. Now there's also a whole new set of things that used to be thought of as completely impossible and now seem just really hard to do if we really fight for them. And that the moving of that window is really, really important on climate, because as fast as things have moved in the last year, they're still not moving nearly fast enough. One way of measuring political progress is all the protest movements and the debate and the climate pledges. Another way is to say, no climate pledge has ever been fulfilled. When the Conservative Parliament declared a climate emergency, they said within 6 months they were going to prepare a plan for how to decarbonize. That deadline passed a few days ago. There's no plan. The 3 years since the Paris Accords were signed, no major industrial nation in the world is on track to meet their commitments. Since those accords were signed, Donald Trump was elected, Jair Bolsonaro was elected, and Xi Jinping has declared himself president for life. So we're dealing with a lot of obstacles. Obstacles that used to seem immovable, but are now, for the first time, because of the political changes that we've seen, because of people who understand the urgency of this crisis and are taking it upon themselves to take action and engage, those once immovable obstacles, the political status quo, the economic status quo, now seem at least movable if we deploy the energy that we can marshal to move them. And that is up to us. It's up to every one of us in this room. It's up to every one of us on this planet. But some of us are doing more than others, and Margaret is probably doing most of all. So, all right.
Well, thank you so much, David, Emily, and Avery for this gracious hosting, and everyone for coming. Before I really start my talk, I'd like to take a moment for, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'd like to take a moment for people to look inward and try to identify what you're feeling when you hear David say 1 billion refugees, twice the conflict. Was it half the agricultural yields? I'm just gonna, conjecture maybe some terror, grief, helplessness, anger. It's a lot of pain. And I want to tell you that pain is healthy. It's part of being a moral person who loves this world and loves your family and the entire human family. And it is a key part of how we are finally going to turn this around. We are going to turn that pain into political action. So the good news that I want to tell everyone is that we have a plan, and it's working, and that we need you all to be a part of it. When I left the field of clinical psychology 5 years ago to do everything that I could to protect humanity in the living world, I founded an organization based on the idea of facing the truth and telling the truth no matter how hard, and advocating for a solution that could actually protect humanity and the living world. The vast majority of groups approach the problem by saying, what is possible? What is politically possible? And the answers are always small, because our politics are so messed up. But we approach it in a different way. We say, what is necessary, and how do we get there? Because only a World War II scale mobilization of our entire economy and society, all hands on deck, is our only chance. We are off the cliff. We don't need to hit the brakes. We need to reverse as quickly as possible. And the mobilization that we need, it's doable. We did it before in World War II. In just a few years, we transformed our entire economy from a consumer economy to a war economy. And we produced enough tanks and planes and machine guns to arm ourselves and the Allies and win the war. So there is historical precedent, there's the technology, and my organization has made plans, right? We should ban all new fossil fuel infrastructure. This is obvious. And set a 10-year timeline to shut down what we have now. We need a massive scale up of renewable energy in order to power the country. And we need a massive energy conservation program. We need to transition to all organic agriculture and rapidly phase out the pesticides that are killing the insects, the absolute cornerstone of our ecosystems and our agriculture. And we need to ban factory farms massively invest in public transit, build high-speed rail everywhere, right? It's, the task is huge. So that's the second part of the plan, is the mobilization itself. The first part is achieving the political conditions that will make that possible. And we're not there, but in the last year, we took a huge step, right? Because 5 years ago, when I started the climate mobilization, we called for a World War II scale climate mobilization for 0 emissions in 10 years or less, and a massive drawdown effort to actually restore a safe climate. And for 4 years, we were like kind of a little marginal, kind of outsiders. We said to the most environmental and climate organizations are gradualist, right? We should reduce emissions over time through policies such as pricing or, cap and trade, carbon tax, something like that, that won't really bother people too much. No big changes, no big sacrifice, right? Just like slow and steady. And nobody wanted to stand with us, and it was, a little lonely, a little challenging, but we decided, we made a campaign internally to move the movement, right? To change this gradualist orientation that was so pervasive. And through that work, not exclusively that work, there's other factors too, but because we basically prefigured what has happened in the last year, which is the explosive growth of the Green New Deal, which is a World War II scale climate mobilization that eliminates US emissions in 10 years. We worked on it a lot. The Green New Deal, the Extinction Rebellion in London that has gone international, that calls for 0 emissions by 2025 and declarations of climate emergency. And through our own campaigning, which we pioneered, Hoboken, New Jersey was the first city in the United States, to declare a climate emergency in late 2017. And then in 2018, Montgomery County, Berkeley, California, several other cities in the Bay Area declared a climate emergency. And then with our allies, Extinction Rebellion, we said, this could really help you guys as a tactic, because it's a way for organizers, for normal people to engage in the democratic process and say, this is a climate emergency and we need to take action, right? Local governments are one of the places where democracy is still really working. And so after making that partnership with Extinction Rebellion, the campaign went exponential. And like more than half of the local governments in the United Kingdom have declared a climate emergency. And as Emily said, my hometown of Ann Arbor just declared a climate emergency and commit to 0 emissions by 2030. New York City declared a climate emergency a few months ago. Miami Beach declared a climate emergency.
They really have one.
And which is like, come on, kind of obvious. Yeah. Right? But there's 2 campaigns right now on the state level that are having sit-ins on state house lawns. That's in Washington State, which is led by a coalition of indigenous tribes, and in Connecticut. So this campaign, and just yesterday, 11,000 scientists publicly declared a climate emergency, which, if you know something about scientists, is, a pretty big thing. They're extremely cautious when talking about risk. So, and then also the school strikers, the youth movement, which has I am so happy to say, has just skipped over gradualism, they don't need it, and gone straight for emergency mobilization as their demands. Okay, so in the last year, we have seen the emergence of a true climate emergency movement that, unlike gradualism, says this is not a problem, this is an emergency, and we don't need a gradual policy, we need to do everything right now. So, hallelujah, the movement is here, but as David said, as everyone knows, we're still nowhere near where we need to be. There's still a huge amount that needs to be done. And so that is the other part of our plan, is to bring this paradigm shift from gradualism into emergency mode to the whole country. We want to create a mobilization fever, an intensity, a passionate intensity for emergency mobilization that matches what this country experienced after the attacks on Pearl Harbor or Fort Sumter, right? Where I want people, starting with this room and expanding out from there, to be crazy for mobilization, right? This is it. This is the only thing that can protect you and me and my family and your family. And it is only with that passionate intensity and level of commitment that we can protect ourselves. And we have to do it together. So my organization is pursuing this mobilization fever in 3 ways. I've already discussed the climate emergency declaration and campaigning that we've done. We want to saturate the country with those campaigns. And it's not just about the declaration. It's about bringing organizers and organizations together with this framework. So they get together, they say, okay, it's a climate emergency, we're gonna get this declaration, and they don't stop there, right? Now there's a group of people that is meeting that has already won something, already entered into a kind of partnership with their local government, and that you just keep going, right? Berkeley, California, after declaring a climate emergency, banned natural gas in new construction. Right? No gas hookups. And now more than 6 California cities have followed their lead. Right? We can through these local campaigns really start to change the paradigm. And as David said, what seemed impossible becomes possible, and then you just move on to the next impossible thing. And that's how you achieve something impossible. So we're going to do the climate emergency declarations. We have a think tank that is producing cutting edge policy. We are proud to say we develop the most aggressive climate policy advocacies of any organization. I'd love to see other extremely aggressive policy development, but I believe at this point that's still true. And that think tank is now convening in a partnership with the Democracy in Europe movement and one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion. We are convening a global mobilization society of intellectuals, thought leaders, academics, futurists, who are in the paradigm of climate emergency and general ecological realism, right? This planet has limits that we cannot surpass without risking everything. So we are bringing together a group of these people to both do scenario planning, right? What should the climate emergency movement do during the next financial crisis, right? How do we approach that strategically? Should the nations of the world retrofit the UN for the climate emergency mobilization, or should we create a new global body to help this? I mean, so we're going to get some of the smartest people in the world to take on these incredibly tough questions, untethered by the assumptions about what is realistic that have held us back for so long. We are not satisfied with what is realistic.
Also, you can change it.
Yeah, we're changing it. And so our third strategy is an emotional one, a psychological one. I have a book coming out in April. Early copies are available. And it's honestly, it's a new genre. It's a self-help book, but about facing the climate emergency, welcoming and honoring the feelings that it brings up, and turning them into action, right? That is the critical thing, because right now, Americans are very concerned the majority of Americans think we are in a climate emergency. And yet there is a spiral of silence that people are not talking about it. Because it's uncomfortable, right? It hurts. When you talk to someone about it, it's kind of like, geez, I'm sorry to like ruin your day. But we need to, so there's the spiral of silence and there's the intellectualism of the climate discussion, right? Science, technology, policy, right? That's mainly where the discussion is at. And when I ask people how they feel about the climate emergency, what comes up for them, one of the most common responses I hear is, no one's ever asked me how I feel about, the coming collapse of civilization. I never thought to have an emotional reaction to a catastrophic future. Like we need to feel it. The pain, the part inside of you that is saying, oh my God, like the red light that is blinking, don't ignore it. Don't say like, oh, whatever, I'm overreacting, calm down. No, listen to it. That pain is telling you something critically important. And it connects us all. We're all feeling it. And again, we're feeling it because the best part of ourselves is saying all life is threatened. And it's calling us to go all in, to become heroic in this moment of terrible danger. So we need you. I'm going to be honest, this is a very influential group of people here. I did research, okay? And if the people here in this room decide, I'm gonna talk about climate emergency all the time to my friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, I will overcome the emotional and social barriers to doing that. And I'm gonna ask people how they feel about it. Not just keep it, do you believe, do you not believe? No, just what's happening in your heart because of this emergency. So break the silence, that's one thing. You can organize your network and your organization, right? If you're in a company or a professional association or a parent-teacher association, right? You can get your organization to declare a climate emergency and make an official statement about the scale of this problem and the massive scale of the necessary solution. And finally, stop funding gradualism and politicians who advocate gradualism, and start funding the climate emergency movement, because it is here, but it is small and it is broke.
Can you say that again?
Stop funding gradualism and start funding the climate emergency movement. Politicians who are not willing to tell the truth and take political risks in terms of advocating for what is necessary do not deserve your support. And by withholding that, it is a huge lever for change. And I want to take this opportunity in talking about funding the climate emergency movement to recognize some supporters of the climate mobilization and our 501c3, the Climate Mobilization Project, who are here. Sorry to embarrass you, but by identifying you, I also am hoping that you can make yourself available to the other people here who are curious about our work, and you can tell them why you support us. So I'd just like to recognize Eric Lemelson, that's right there, sorry. Roberta Baskin, Jay Halfon, Lee Wasserman, Jim Street, don't know where you are, and Peter Boker. So we have, and Larry Linden, absolutely, a new but valued supporter.
Larry.
Thank you. it's, you know, it's just the truth about nonprofit life that we are, my organization and the movement is reliant on your support. And so to our old supporters, potentially new supporters, I just truly thank you for believing in us and not being limited by these ideas about what is possible. What is possible leads us to catastrophe. And it's time to go beyond it. It's time to do what is necessary. And we will take questions.